Today, we're diving deep into the rise of one of Africa's most powerful voices of change, Ibrahim Traoré, a leader who has ignited a spark of resistance against the forces of colonial influence that have long held Africa in a chokehold. In this video, we're not just exploring the actions of one man, we're examining a movement, a vision for a new Africa that rejects the remnants of colonialism, embraces unity, and charts a bold path towards true independence. Ibrahim Traoré's stand against foreign domination, particularly the economic stranglehold of former colonial powers like France, is shaking up the political landscape of West Africa, and his actions are sending shockwaves across the globe. But this is more than just a political struggle. It's a battle for Africa's future, a future that does not rely on external powers, foreign aid, or exploitative trade deals. As Traoré pushes back against the forces that have kept the continent in chains, we ask, what does it mean for Africa to truly stand on its own? What is the cost of freedom, and what does the resistance to such a vision say about the power dynamics that have shaped Africa's history? Stay tuned as we explore the heart of this fight and its profound implications for the future of Africa. In the heart of West Africa, in the land of Burkina Faso, a new figure has emerged whose name is becoming synonymous with hope, defiance, and a new vision for Africa's future. Ibrahim Traoré, a military officer who once fought on the front lines to protect his people, has risen to power not just through sheer force, but through a relentless commitment to a cause much larger than himself. His story is not one of entitlement or privilege, but rather a story of struggle, sacrifice, and an unyielding desire to free his country from the shackles of foreign influence. Burkina Faso, though a relatively small nation in terms of geographical size, has a history that looms large in Africa's collective consciousness. It has always been a land of resilience, a place where the will of the people to chart their own destiny has clashed against the forces of colonialism, exploitation, and foreign control. From the time it was colonized by the French to the post-independence years marked by political instability and foreign-backed coups, Burkina Faso's journey has been anything but easy. But it is within this tumultuous backdrop that Ibrahim Traoré found his calling, a calling to bring about change that would not just alter the course of Burkina Faso's history, but would reverberate across the entire continent of Africa. Traoré's rise to power was not one marked by a series of political maneuvers or backroom deals. Instead, it was a reflection of the dissatisfaction of a nation that had seen its leadership continually fail to meet the needs and aspirations of its people. Burkina Faso, like many African nations, had long struggled with corruption, economic inequality, and the influence of foreign powers that sought to exploit its resources without regard for the well-being of its citizens. And so, when the people of Burkina Faso saw the chance to make a change, they rallied behind a leader who seemed to embody the very essence of their struggle for self-determination. In 2022, when Ibrahim Traoré led a military coup to oust then-President Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba, he did not do so out of a desire for power, but rather out of a deep sense of urgency. Burkina Faso was facing an escalating crisis, with insurgent groups linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIS gaining ground in the north and east of the country. Damiba's inability to effectively address the growing security threats led to widespread discontent, and the military, led by Traoré, took action to protect the nation from collapse. The coup was a bold and decisive move, but it was also a statement that the people of Burkina Faso would no longer accept weak leadership or foreign interference in their affairs. From the very moment of his rise, Traoré made it clear that his leadership would not be business as usual. Unlike many African leaders who have historically bowed to the pressures of foreign powers, Traoré's stance was firm. Burkina Faso would no longer be a puppet to foreign interests. His message was simple, yet powerful. We will stand for our sovereignty. We will no longer allow ourselves to be pawns in the geopolitical games of foreign powers. But it wasn't just his words that caught the attention of the world. it was his actions. The very first thing Traoré did upon assuming power was expelling French troops from Burkina Faso, effectively ending the long-standing military presence of former colonial power France in the country. This bold move was a direct challenge to the colonial legacy that still grips many African nations. It was a resounding declaration that Burkina Faso would no longer be a playground for foreign interests. This act of defiance resonated deeply across the African continent, where many nations continue to face the lingering effects of colonialism and the influence of former colonial powers. Traoré's rise was not just about rejecting the old guard of African politics. It was about embracing a new vision for the future. He recognized that the challenges facing Burkina Faso were not isolated to his country alone, but were part of a larger struggle across Africa. His vision for the future was one of pan-African unity, economic independence, and the rejection of the colonial mindset that continues to shape African politics and economics today. One of Traoré's most significant moves since taking power has been his push to end the use of the CFA franc, the currency used by 14 African countries that is guaranteed by the French treasury. The CFA franc, which was created during the colonial period, has long been a symbol of France's continued economic control over its former colonies. By pushing for the abandonment of the CFA franc, Traoré is signaling to Africa that it is time to take control of its own economic destiny. It is a move that challenges the very foundations of the financial systems that have kept African nations dependent on the West for far too long. But Traoré's leadership goes beyond his rejection of foreign influence. It is about the vision he has for a new Africa, an Africa that is not beholden to the West, but is strong, united, and self-sustaining. He is calling for greater cooperation between African nations, urging them to set aside their differences and work together to build a continent that can stand on its own feet. His message is clear. Africa's future is in the hands of Africans, and it is time to build a new narrative for the continent, one that is rooted in sovereignty, unity, and self-determination. Ibrahim Traoré's rise is a powerful reminder that leadership is not just about occupying a position of power. It is about having the courage to challenge the status quo and the conviction to lead a nation toward a better future. His journey is not just a story of political ascent, but a reflection of the hopes and dreams of millions of Africans who yearn for a continent that is truly free. In Traoré, they see not just a military leader, but a symbol of the future. A future where Africa's potential is unlocked, its resources are harnessed for the benefit of its people, and its nations stand together as equals on the global stage. Ibrahim Traoré's rise is just the beginning. It is a moment in history that will shape the trajectory of Africa for generations to come. His leadership is the spark that could ignite a fire of change across the continent, one that will burn away the remnants of colonialism and pave the way for a new, stronger Africa. The world is watching, and Burkina Faso is leading the way. To fully understand the profound significance of Ibrahim Traoré's leadership and his defiance against foreign influence, it is essential to examine the deep historical context of colonialism in Africa. For centuries, Africa's fate was shaped not by the will of its people, but by the ambitions of foreign powers, particularly European nations, that sought to exploit its rich resources and peoples for their own gain. This history, marked by brutality, exploitation, and the systematic dismantling of African societies, still casts a long shadow over the continent. The legacy of colonialism, although officially abolished, continues to influence the political, economic, and social fabric of African nations. Ibrahim Traoré's fight is not only for the sovereignty of Burkina Faso, but for the liberation of Africa from the shackles of this enduring legacy. The colonial era began in earnest in the late 19th century, during the so-called Scramble for Africa. European powers, including Britain, France, Belgium, and Germany, descended upon Africa like vultures, carving up the continent into spheres of influence with little regard for the indigenous peoples who had lived there for millennia. At the time, Africa was a mosaic of complex societies, rich with cultural diversity, resources, and ancient traditions. But this history was erased as colonial powers sought to impose their own systems of governance, economy, and culture upon the land. The imposition of European borders disrupted the intricate social structures and political systems that had existed for centuries. Ethnic groups, previously living in harmony, were suddenly split by artificial borders, leading to tension and conflict that persists to this day. Colonial powers not only divided the land, but also sought to dominate the people through force. Millions of Africans were enslaved, exploited, and subjected to forced labor on plantations, mines, and in other industries designed to fuel European economies. One of the most egregious examples of this exploitation was the Belgian rule over the Congo, where millions of Congolese were murdered, mutilated, or enslaved in the pursuit of rubber and ivory. The brutality of colonialism knew no bounds, and the psychological scars left by this period of history have yet to be fully healed. But what makes this history even more insidious is that it was not just about territorial expansion or resource extraction. It was about the complete subjugation of African identity and the imposition of a European worldview that dehumanized and marginalized the people of Africa. When many African nations gained independence in the mid-20th century, there was a collective hope that the days of foreign domination were behind them. But the reality of post-colonial Africa has been far more complex. While formal colonialism ended, the structures that kept Africa under the control of European powers persisted. The so-called neocolonialism, the continued dominance of African nations by foreign powers through economic, political, and military means, ensured that the continent's true independence remained an elusive dream for many. The most glaring example of this neocolonial influence is the economic system that continues to bind African nations to former colonial powers. Many African countries are still dependent on foreign aid, trade deals that favor their former colonizers, and the exploitation of their natural resources by multinational corporations. One of the most significant tools of neocolonialism is the CFA franc, a currency used by 14 African countries that are still under the monetary control of France. Although these nations technically gained independence, the CFA franc ensures that their economies remain tethered to France, whose central bank guarantees the currency. This financial system, created during the colonial period, allows France to maintain significant economic leverage over its former colonies. In addition to economic domination, many African nations still find themselves under the influence of foreign military powers. France, for example, continues to maintain military bases in several African countries, often justifying their presence as part of the fight against terrorism and insurgency. But these military interventions are often seen as a means of preserving French interests, particularly in countries that are rich in natural resources or strategically important. The presence of foreign military forces in African nations has sparked a growing sense of resentment among the people, who view these forces as symbols of a continued colonial presence on the continent. Political systems in Africa have also been heavily influenced by colonial powers. The structures of governance established by the Europeans were designed to serve their interests, not those of the African people. Many African countries inherited systems that were ill-suited to their cultural and social realities. The parliamentary systems, legal frameworks, and bureaucratic structures imposed by colonial powers often led to political instability, as they failed to account for the diversity of African societies. The result has been a series of weak governments, characterized by corruption, inefficiency, and the inability to deliver basic services to the people. One of the most insidious aspects of colonialism's legacy is the psychological impact it has had on African identity. For centuries, Africans were told that their cultures, languages, and traditions were inferior to those of their European colonizers. Colonial education systems sought to erase African history and replace it with a European-centered worldview. Even today, many Africans still grapple with the aftermath of this cultural erasure as they struggle to reclaim and celebrate their indigenous heritage. But despite the overwhelming challenges, Africa has not been passive in the face of this legacy. Across the continent, there has been a growing movement to confront the colonial past and demand the freedom and independence that Africa has long been denied. This movement has been led by visionaries like Ibrahim Traoré, who understand that true liberation cannot be achieved until Africa frees itself from the grip of neocolonialism. Traoré's leadership represents a break from the old ways of thinking, a rejection of the colonial mentality that has held Africa back for so long. His fight is not just for the sovereignty of Burkina Faso, but for the sovereignty of all African nations. By challenging the influence of foreign powers, rejecting the CFA Franc, and advocating for greater unity among African nations, Traoré is offering a new vision for the future, one that is not defined by the past, but by the potential of what Africa can achieve when it stands together, free from the shackles of colonial control. This fight is not just about the physical borders of African countries, but about reclaiming Africa's identity, its dignity, and its place in the world. Ibrahim Traoré's defiance against colonial influence is a call to action for all Africans, a reminder that the struggle for true independence is far from over. The road to freedom is long and fraught with challenges, but as Traoré's leadership shows, it is a road worth traveling. In the complex political landscape of modern Africa, Ibrahim Traoré represents more than just a figurehead of military leadership. He is a symbol of hope, a beacon for the future of a continent that has endured centuries of exploitation, both physical and psychological. When he speaks of a new Africa, it is not just rhetoric. It is the articulation of a profound vision, one that calls for the dismantling of old, outdated systems that have kept Africa under the control of foreign powers, and the creation of something radically different, something grounded in the strength, unity, and self-determination of its people. Traoré's vision for a new Africa begins with a fundamental and uncompromising stance. Africa must control its own destiny. This vision is rooted in the belief that Africa, as a continent rich in resources, culture, and human potential, has the capacity to stand on its own 2 feet, free from the influence of former colonial powers and their modern-day equivalents. But this is not just about economic independence. It is about creating a new political, social, and cultural landscape where African nations work in harmony to achieve collective prosperity. Central to Traoré's vision is the idea of a pan-African identity, an identity that transcends borders and embraces the rich diversity that makes the continent unique. For far too long, Africa has been fragmented, with each nation facing its own internal struggles, often exacerbated by external pressures. The legacy of colonialism left Africa divided, with borders drawn without regard to ethnic, cultural, or linguistic ties. But Traoré understands that true liberation will only come when African countries stop seeing themselves as isolated entities and begin to see their shared history and common future. His call for unity is not just about diplomacy or political alliances. It is about fostering a sense of solidarity among African nations. When African countries work together, pooling their resources, knowledge, and collective will, they can overcome the economic and political challenges that have historically held them back. This unity is not a mere dream, but a practical necessity for the survival and growth of the African continent. Traoré's vision is to create a united Africa, one that is strong enough to stand up to external pressures and powerful enough to create lasting, positive change within its borders. At the heart of this vision is economic independence. Traoré firmly believes that Africa must free itself from the shackles of foreign economic control, especially the neo-colonial systems that continue to exploit the continent's wealth. One of his first actions upon taking power was to challenge the use of the CFA Franc, a currency that links 14 African nations to France's central bank. This currency, which was imposed during the colonial period, continues to serve as a symbol of Africa's economic subjugation. By rejecting the CFA franc and pushing for the creation of a new, independent African currency, Traoré aims to give African nations the financial autonomy they need to control their economic destinies. This bold move is not just symbolic. It is a critical step toward creating an Africa that can trade freely, develop its industries, and ensure that the wealth generated by its people stays within its own borders. But Traoré's vision for economic independence goes beyond currency reform. It includes a concerted effort to build infrastructure, strengthen industries, and empower local businesses. By investing in Africa's youth, providing education, and fostering innovation, he envisions a continent that is not just dependent on exporting raw materials, but is also capable of developing its own technologies and industries. This transformation is vital for Africa's long-term prosperity, as it will allow the continent to move away from its historical role as a supplier of cheap labor and raw materials and into the role of a global leader in innovation, industry, and trade. At the same time, Traoré understands that economic growth alone is not enough. True progress can only be achieved if Africa develops politically as well. For years, African nations have been plagued by weak, corrupt governments that have been too reliant on foreign aid and political support to govern effectively. Traoré's vision includes a political system where leaders are accountable to their people, where democracy is not just a foreign concept, but a system that reflects the values and aspirations of the African people. He calls for an end to the era of puppet governments that serve the interests of foreign powers, and for the rise of leadership that is rooted in the needs and desires of the citizens they serve. This vision extends to the social fabric of African nations as well. Traoré advocates for the preservation and promotion of African cultures, languages, and traditions. One of the most insidious effects of colonialism was its attempt to erase African identities, replacing them with foreign ideals and systems. The modern African Renaissance that Traoré envisions is one where Africans reconnect with their roots, celebrating their rich cultural heritage while embracing the future. It is an Africa where pride in one's identity, language, and history is central to the continent's success. In this new Africa, education will be a cornerstone, not just in the sense of academic achievement, but in the development of a collective African consciousness, one that empowers the next generation to take their place in the world as leaders, innovators, and problem solvers. Another key element of Traoré's vision is the security and safety of Africa's people. For decades, the continent has been plagued by instability, often due to the interference of foreign powers or the presence of armed groups that destabilize entire regions. Traoré has made it clear that one of his top priorities is to secure Burkina Faso and other African nations from these external and internal threats. But security is not just about military strength. It is about building strong, resilient communities that can withstand both external aggression and internal strife. In his vision, security is an integral part of the political and economic fabric of a new Africa where peace is the foundation upon which progress is built. Ibrahim Traoré's vision for a new Africa is not a distant dream. It is a call to action. It is a call for every African, from the youth to the elders, to rise up and claim their rightful place in the world. It is a reminder that Africa's future will not be shaped by others, but by the determination, unity, and resilience of its people. And in this vision, Traoré is not just a leader, he is a catalyst for the transformation that Africa has long needed. This new Africa is one where African nations are no longer pawns in global power games, but players in their own right, charting their own course based on their values, resources, and aspirations. It is an Africa that draws strength from its diversity, leverages its immense potential, and moves boldly into a future that is bright, unified, and free. Ibrahim Traoré is not merely a political leader. He is a visionary who embodies the hopes and dreams of millions of Africans who long for a continent that is truly independent, truly sovereign, and truly free. His vision for a new Africa is one that resonates far beyond Burkina Faso. It is a vision that has the power to transform the entire continent. Ibrahim Traoré's rise to power and his bold vision for a new Africa have not been without significant resistance. His rejection of foreign influence and his call for Africa's true independence have challenged the status quo, provoking powerful reactions from those who benefit from the existing systems of neocolonialism, exploitation, and dominance. As with any leader who dares to confront entrenched power structures, Traoré has faced considerable backlash, not just from foreign governments and multinational corporations, but also from within Africa itself, where the forces of conservatism, old political elites, and corrupt leaders have made their opposition clear. At the international level, Traoré's defiance has been met with swift condemnation. His decision to expel French troops from Burkina Faso and his vocal stance against France's continued economic dominance have created ripples of concern across Europe. France, which had once been the colonial master of much of West Africa, is deeply invested in maintaining its influence in the region. The presence of French military forces in former colonies has long been a source of tension, and Traoré's actions have only amplified these tensions. His refusal to adhere to the traditional Western-backed political playbook has raised alarms in Paris and other Western capitals, where leaders fear that his rise could inspire other African leaders to challenge the economic and military dominance of the West. But Traoré's challenge is not just limited to France. His push for economic independence, particularly his efforts to end the use of the CFA franc, has struck a nerve with international financial institutions and multinationals. The CFA franc is part of a larger system that has allowed France and other former colonial powers to maintain significant economic leverage over their former colonies. The rejection of this currency is seen as a direct threat to the economic order that has been in place for decades, a system that benefits Western powers at the expense of Africa's development. For institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank, whose influence over African economies is well documented, Traoré's move represents a challenge to the global financial system that has long kept African nations in a subordinate role. The multinational corporations that exploit Africa's vast natural resources are also wary of Traoré's vision for a new Africa. For years, companies from the West and China have extracted Africa's wealth, whether it be oil, minerals, or agricultural products, often without regard for the local population. These companies have played a major role in propping up weak, corrupt governments that allow them to operate with impunity, exploiting the continent's resources for their own profit. Traoré's calls for resource nationalism, the idea that Africa must retain control over its own resources, threaten the interests of these multinational corporations, who stand to lose the privileges they have enjoyed for decades. In response to these challenges, there has been a growing backlash from within Africa itself. Political elites, many of whom are beneficiaries of the old order, have become increasingly vocal in their opposition to Traoré's radical vision. These elites, often closely aligned with foreign powers and multinational corporations, fear that Traoré's reforms will upend the power dynamics that have allowed them to maintain their grip on power. For these leaders, Traoré's call for unity and independence is a direct challenge to the status quo, one that could result in the loss of both political and economic influence. In countries across Africa, there are leaders who have been complicit in perpetuating the systems of foreign domination. Some are outright puppets of Western powers, while others are more subtle in their alliances. These leaders, afraid of losing their positions of power, have worked to discredit Traoré and undermine his influence. They warn of instability and chaos, painting Traoré as a radical who threatens to plunge Burkina Faso, and potentially the entire region, into a new cycle of conflict and unrest. These accusations are not just politically motivated. They are part of a broader effort to keep Africa's leadership firmly within the grip of the old guard, which is content to maintain the existing, unequal relationships with the West. This resistance is not just political, it is also ideological. For decades, African nations have been taught that they are incapable of managing their own affairs. The narrative of dependency, that Africa needs the West for aid, investment, and security, has been ingrained in the minds of many Africans. But Traoré's rise challenges this narrative. By rejecting foreign aid, expelling foreign troops, and seeking to reclaim control over Africa's resources, he is redefining what is possible for the continent. His leadership is a reminder that Africa has the potential to be self-sufficient, to govern itself, and to shape its own destiny. This message is particularly powerful for the younger generation, who are increasingly disillusioned with the old political systems that have failed to deliver the progress and prosperity they were promised. The backlash against Traoré is not just a reflection of the challenges he faces as a leader, it is a reflection of the broader struggle for Africa's future. The forces that resist his vision are the same forces that have kept Africa in a state of perpetual underdevelopment, dependency, and subjugation. But the growing support for his leadership shows that there is a deep desire for change, for a new Africa that is free from the grip of foreign influence and ready to take its place as a global leader. If you believe in Africa's potential and the power of sovereignty, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content that keeps you informed, inspired, and ready to take action. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay tuned for the latest on the stories.